Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador. Now, I've heard some rumours online about a new Sony macro lens. Now, I have no idea whether this macro lens is in development or not, but the rumour was reported on Sony Alpha Rumours and it says it's a 100mm F2.8 Macro GM with optical steady shot. Great news, but I've got no idea whether this lens is, or this rumour is just wishful thinking or not. So it's on this wishful thinking that I thought I would express some thoughts out loud. Because when I was looking at a lot of the macro reviews for the Sigma and Tamron macro lenses and also Sony's macro lens, I was aware that what I was seeing was not really macro, not really 1:1 magnification. It was really just in the ballpark of close-up photography. Now, there are many lenses that have good close-up capability without the need for a macro lens. Full macro is often described as having a 1x magnification ratio or 1:1. Now, there are some half macro lenses, and these are also advertised as being macro lenses with a 0.5x magnification ratio, and that includes Sony's FE7200 f4 Macro G2. Now, these three lenses from Sigma, Sony and Tamron, they're all 90mm full macro lenses for full frame cameras. Now, they have similar specifications, but there is a little bit of variability. For instance, the Sony lens has optical steady shot, whilst the Tamron and Sigma have slightly faster autofocus than the aging Sony lens there. If you were just building a 90mm f2.8 lens that didn't have macro capability, you could actually build these lenses a lot smaller. For instance, here's the Sigma 90mm DG full frame lens there. It only has a 0.2 magnification ratio, so nowhere near the 1x magnification ratio of, say, that Tamron, but it is appreciably smaller. In fact, the Tamron was the lightest of those full macro lenses, and you can see it's pretty much twice the size of this small Sigma 90mm lens here. If we take a look at the specifications in great detail, again you can see that Tamron is the smallest and lightest of those 90mm macro lenses. It also has reasonably fast autofocus speed, and it is priced down quite reasonably there. So the Sony has image stabilization, but with that slower autofocus. And I've also put in the column on the extreme right there, Sony's FE7200 f4G, and that's a half macro lens, but it does have blazingly fast autofocus, and it does, or is, a zoom lens. So there are going to be some people who are drawn to that lens even though it doesn't have the full macro capability, and I'll talk about this last lens in a little bit more detail later. With the 90mm macro, the autofocus is slow, so when I own this lens I tended to use this with the manual focus only, and if I was this close to an insect I would just rock in or out to get that critical focus on the head of this particular butterfly here. Most of the time I'm a little bit further back, or I'm photographing creatures that are a little bit bigger than insects, such as this tiny little tree frog here, which is just a couple of inches high. Now, interestingly, when I photographed this with the 90mm Sony macro lens, because of the slow autofocus, it did take a little bit of a time to get critical focus, but of course the frog wasn't moving, so that didn't pose a huge issue. Now, I was probably only at 0.35x magnification, even though this lens has 1:1 capability. If I was going in for 1:1, I'd probably only get the eye or the top of the head of this frog framed up. Given that I was only photographing with a 0.35x magnification ratio, I found it actually easier, because of the snappier autofocus, to photograph this particular tree frog with the 100-400 GM, which does indeed have that 0.35x magnification ratio, which is one of Sony's better close focusing distance lenses. Now, here's a shot of an insect that I photographed with a lens without great close-up capability. It's got a 0.29x magnification ratio, so it's only 1/3 or just slightly lower than 1/3 macro full-frame capability there. It is a very affordable APS-C lens, which is the 18-135. Now I have cropped in on this image to get more magnification. Now I've cropped down to the 4K pixel resolution 3840 by 2160 pixels, but this is a much tighter crop from the original image. Now this was captured with an Alpha 6700 APS-C camera. You could also equate this to shooting in APS-C mode on a full frame camera. Now if I magnify the 0.29 magnification ratio by the 1.6 times post-production crop, we see that we're approaching a half macro magnification ratio, to be precise 0.464 there. Now if I crop any tighter in this, then I'll be below those 4K pixel resolutions, but you'll see that I did get that insect pretty much full frame there. Now there is a lens that has better close focusing distance. In fact, one of the best lenses that is not described as being a macro lens is the FE20-70 f4G. Now this has a 0.39 times magnification ratio, and as I said, you can get really very close to this. As you can see on that inset image, how close I am getting to those leaves. Any closer and I'll probably start shading those leaves and feathers with the actual lens. If you were photographing something that was 2 inches tall, you can see that 2 inches tall is slightly bigger than the E mount. We can actually fill the frame with this small Mickey Mouse. For many people, full macro capability isn't really a great requirement. In fact, many of the macro reviews I was watching online, nearly all of the examples being shown were just close-up photographs. They weren't approaching that 1:1 magnification ratio. Now if you look at the close focusing distance, which is another way of describing that capability, 0.3 meters to 0.25 meters, you'll see that that distance seems to be a little bit longer than I was just showcasing in the previous slide, and that's because the distance is measured to the imaging sensor, not to the front of the lens. So I think that this was pretty much as close as I'd need to go with this 20-70 zoom. And that 20-70 zoom holds that 0.39 times magnification ratio across that zoom range, so that is another great advantage of that zoom lens there. If I highlight all of the Sony lenses that have got good close-up capability, you'll see the 3 dedicated macro lenses are listed above, including that half macro, the 7200 f4 Macro G2. The ones below in the darker blue are the ones with good close focusing distance that are not described as macro lenses. The 2070 is the hero of these with a 0.39, quickly followed by the 100-400 GM, the 2450 f2.8, and even the 7200 f2.8 and 2470 f2.8, the second versions of these G Masters, have a 0.32 times magnification ratio. Now there are quite a few lenses that come close to this, but these are the top 5 Sony lenses that do have the best close focusing capability. Let's move over to that 7200, which is that half macro 0.5 times magnification ratio. You only have to drop into APS-C mode and you're getting 0.75 times magnification ratio. Now this is pretty much an uncropped image from that crop in camera. So you can see that if we were shooting say with an A7R5 or an A7CR, we'd be getting 26 megapixels and filling the frame with this small butterfly here. And again, going full frame on this, well, it's in APS-C mode, but we're filling the frame with this small butterfly. Again, 0.75 times magnification ratio. One of the great things about using this 7200 Macro F4G OSS is, one, it's got image stabilization, but more importantly, it's got quad linear focus motors. And so with subject recognition set to insects, you can take pictures of flying insects as well as insects crawling over flower heads, which I think is pretty much a game changer when I started reviewing this particular lens. It's so much of a game changer, I sold my 90mm macro lens in favor of the 7200. Now that 7200, if we don't want to shoot in APS-C mode, we could instead just put on a 1.4 times teleconverter to get a 0.7 times magnification ratio. With the 2 times teleconverter, we go 1.1 macro. So this does have macro capability with teleconverters without having to crop in post-production editing. So here's a 0.7 times magnification ratio using the 1.4 times tele. I think this is really close enough for what I'm doing with these insects. I do want to have some context, and I could crop in much tighter if I required. Here's that 0.5 times magnification ratio on a 2-inch figure, this time Minnie Mouse instead of Mickey Mouse. But on that inset image you can see how Mickey compares to the size of the E-mount that we use on our cameras. So we can go pretty much half length on a 2-inch figure of Minnie Mouse here with a 0.5 times magnification ratio. And if I put on the 1.4 times teleconverter and drop into the APS-C mode, we can see we've got a 1.125 times magnification ratio, and I'm now struggling to squeeze Minnie's head into the full frame. This is again sort of highlights that for some people this is magnification enough. If we're not photographing maybe the head of a small insect, we're photographing the entire insect, we can see that there's ways to get to this magnification ratio without buying a 1.1 macro lens. Now here's the 7200 this time with the 2 times teleconverter. We lose 2 stops now, so we're down to F8. But when working very, very close, as is the case with macro photography, depth of field is very, very shallow, even when shooting with F8 and F11. So this is not really a drawback to having to put on these teleconverters, because if we were to shoot any wider than F8, we're not going to get that head of that flower all in sharp focus. In fact, I don't have the leading edges of that flower head in sharp focus. Here's another example, also F8 with a 2 times teleconverter with that 1 times magnification ratio. And as I said, the 1.4 and 2 times are great if you don't want to be cropping too much in post-production editing. So here are the full frame macro options that I think I would be recommending at the moment before perhaps a new Sony macro lens is released. Now the 2070 f4 with that 0.39 times, I think that has some things going for it. It is lighter and smaller than that Tamron 90mm macro. It does have the advantage of being a zoom lens, and it's reasonably priced. Now the image stabilization is not in the lens, so you are going to be relying on the in-body image stabilization of the camera. Some people who want the longer focal lengths with macro, maybe when shooting flying insects or whatever, might be drawn to that 7200 f4G2. One of the advantages of me maybe packing for lightweight travel is I could get the 2070 and 7200 with the good close focusing capability, both of those in a medium sized 7-litre messenger bag. And I don't need to be worried about taking a separate macro lens with me, because in 99% of instances this is as close as I need to go with these 2 lenses. Going back to those full macro lenses for full frame cameras, those 90mm f2.8, now those will be needed by some photographers just because I'm not wanting to get closer to maybe the head of an insect. That doesn't mean to say all photographers will be happy with a half macro lens. But I am drawn to the fact that if there was to be a new macro or half macro lens from Sony, then it is possible to bring the size down, maybe to half the size of those 90mm macro lenses. Something that's approaching maybe the Sony f1.8 85mm, which is getting slightly old now. If there was something in that focal range, 85 to 100mm, of that sort of size, then I perhaps would invest in that type of lens, even though I have the 7200 a half macro lens. Here are the full frame macro options if Sony were going to release a new lens. What would I like to see on that new Sony lens that maybe draw me to maybe buy that lens? And I'd be looking for half macro capability as well as it being a portrait prime. So ideally I'd want the weight to come below a pound, maybe 0.9 pounds, 400 grams would be an attractive weight. No longer than 3.5 inches. 0.5 times magnification ratio would be enough for me, given that on my R cameras I could shoot in APS-C mode and get a 0.75 times magnification ratio. I think it would need image stabilization. A lot of these telephoto primes don't have inbuilt image stabilization, but I would like to see that retained for close-up macro capability, handheld. I would like it to have an aperture ring, and I'd expect it to have fast AF. And I'd like it to be priced competitively, so just coming in slightly below $1,000 would be a very attractive price point for many photographers. So the size, as you could see there, it would be very attractive when compared to the existing full macro lenses, the 90mm 2.8 with 1.1 capability. As I said, for my own line of work, and I think for many other people as well, half macro would suffice. Some people will be saying, well, could a lens be built down to those sort of sizes, Mark, if we're just working with a 0.5 times magnification ratio and OSS or stabilization built into that lens? Is that size realistic? One of the things that I would draw your attention to is, yes, I think it is possible, because Canon have got an 85mm f2. Now that's appreciably wider than f2.8, one stop wider, and they've got their half macro lens, 0.5 times magnification, down to 1.1 pounds, 500 grams. So I think shaving off one stop of light gathering capability does mean that 400 grams, 0.9 pounds is definitely a ballpark figure for getting that lens down further in size and weight. Now that Canon is stabilized, so I think this is a realistic proposition that I'm putting forward. If the Sony release a GM f2.8 with full macro capability, I don't expect the size to be small. If that is the case, then I would probably be recommending people who want that half macro capability, even if it does mean shooting in APS-C mode, is to look at the 2070 f4G or the 2450 f2.8G. Both of these can get that half macro capability when shooting in APS-C mode. So I think these are already realistic options for people who don't need to wait to see whether there's a new Sony macro lens that they would want to perhaps purchase. As I said, that f2.8 or f4 capability is still going to be good for a portrait prime, in my opinion. This is with the 2070 at f4, and you can still see that we get great figure ground separation even when reducing the focal length back to 50mm, as is the case here. And again, slightly longer focal length this time. I think this is photographed with perhaps a 70mm, but again, very shallow depth of field, enough for figure ground separation. So I really don't think we need to go to that 2.8 even if we wanted that light portrait prime with macro capability. And here is that at 70mm. Again, I do get a lot of close-up work, rings on fingers and hands, but I don't need that full macro capability to shoot that type of detail work on the portrait photography that I'm capturing. Just a reminder that I have lots of ebooks on my patreon.com/Mark Gaylor support channel. These are 600 and 700 page ebooks. Just head over to, as I said, patreon.com/Mark Gaylor to subscribe for 1 month. That'll cost you US $10. No ongoing contracts or commitments. You can basically unsubscribe just for that single $10 purchase there. Now, interestingly, one of the seminars, extended seminars I have covered is lens choice, because it is a minefield when you're choosing particular lenses that best suit your own needs. So I've tried to address that in a 2-hour lens choice seminar there, and that's one of over 30 hours of seminar content that is on my Patreon support channel. Hopefully you found this interesting. Just give me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you online or over at Patreon shortly.